On October 24th, 1929, known as Black Thursday, the New York Stock Exchange crashed in a wild day of panic. This great crash immediately struck the Toronto and Montreal stock exchanges. Canadian investors lost their life savings. This was followed by a drop in commodity prices, weakening consumer demand, and a loss of access to credit. The Great Depression had begun. Over the next 2 years, the Canadian unemployment rate rose to 19%. Luckily for the inhabitants of Powell River, its paper mill had been experiencing exceptionally high demand for its newsprint in the fall of 1929, well beyond its own capacity to meet the orders. At that exact time, the Powell River Company had already started on expansion projects that would provide hundreds of new jobs, just as the rest of the country was reeling under the Depression. In 1930, the Powell River Company constructed a dam and powerhouse at Stillwater. That year, the Powell River Company employed 1,300 mill workers and 680 construction workers, a very high percentage of the district's population of just under 5,000 people. In other parts of Canada, the Depression forced tens of thousands of young men to become transients, crisscrossing the country looking for jobs, and many found work in Powell River. In the forests and on the islands near town, some people bought cheap land and made a simple living logging, fishing, and homesteading. A larger influx came in 1931 when the Canadian government established a relief camp for single unemployed men south of Duck Lake near town. The men in these relief camps earned 20 cents a day for 8 hours of hard work, building roads and digging ditches by hand. Although the camps were technically voluntary, anyone deserting the camp was blacklisted and not allowed back in. Things turned for the worse in Powell River in 1931 when there was a great purge in the mill of foreign and politically radicalized workers. In 1931, 3 Italian workers died when a scaffold collapsed at an old chimney, and then 37 other Italians were released from their employment in the mill. The purge had begun. The new resident mill manager, Joe Falconer, fired 350 mill workers over the next couple of years. Many of these men were blacklisted for having attended a meeting of the CCF provincial candidate Ernest Bakewell in 1933. By the end of 1934, those fired for having voted for the CCF included half of all of the Italian workers. Most of the men who had been fired left town to look for work, while some others did stay behind on relief, and they supported their families by working on the roads. Life still was not easy for those who were fortunate enough to hold their jobs. In 1932, local resident Walter Cavanaugh wanted to build a home for himself, but he couldn't because his application for a loan had been rejected by the bank. At the time, an ordinary person would not be able to obtain a loan or mortgage from a traditional bank. Walter Cavanaugh realized that he was not the only person to have experienced the frustration of such a rejection. He became determined to find an alternative. He ended up forming a study group with Father Leo Hobson that met at the local parish hall, and after years of meetings and planning, the first credit union in British Columbia was chartered in Powell River on June the 9th, 1939. This new institution aimed to grant an alternative for savings and loans for local residents, and many of its first members had less than $10 to their name. In 1933, about 1/3 of Canadians were outside of the labor force, and about 1/5 of the population was on government relief. In Powell River, the shortage of meaningful work meant that part-time mill workers spent long periods on relief or supporting themselves by living off the land and fishing. During the hardest years of the Depression, many local residents lived as homesteaders with virtually no income whatsoever. Ingrid Cowie remembered that in those years her mother would reuse cloth flour sacks to make clothes for her and her siblings and tablecloths for home. Ingrid said that for her farming family living north of town, the poverty was as bad in the 1930s as had it been in the 1920s. Many other rural families supported themselves with their own gardens, farm animals, and knitting with their own wool. Homesteaders on Nelson Island would eat deer, fish, clams, and would use seaweed as fertilizer to grow their crops. The parallels between the present COVID-19 crisis and the Great Depression are quite striking. The stock market crash that started on March 9, 2020, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, known as Black Monday, was one of the sharpest drops in global stock markets ever. The quarantines and social distancing has led to a reduction in consumer spending, job losses, and a drop in certain commodity prices, representing the sharpest drop in economic activity in Canada since the Great Depression. Unfortunately for Powell River, and unlike the high demand and expansion experienced in 1929, the mill is now facing a material fiber shortage and recovering from a malware attack. Rather than expanding its operations as in 1929, it is in an extended curtailment of its paper operations. So this time around, the local economy is not being sheltered from the wider economic crisis by its largest employer, as had been the case in the Great Depression. That being said, Powell River is a totally different place than what it was a century earlier, with about half of its much bigger and largely retiree population no longer actively participating in the labor force. What's more, in April of this year, the adjusted unemployment rate for Canada spiked at 17.8%, and Powell River was no exception. Like during the Depression, those most affected by unemployment were vulnerable workers from the lowest paid jobs, though unlike the Great Depression, there have been significant temporary government benefits to assist them. It is too soon to tell what the long-term implications will be of the coronavirus recession, but if history teaches us anything, it may well take years for things to get back to normal, though they may never quite be the same as what they were before this all started. What were some of the big changes in Powell River that came out of the Great Depression? And how did the economic troubles come to an end? The hardships experienced during these years and the bitterness left by the Great Purge was not forgotten by mill workers. In 1937, 80% of the mill employees voted to join unions. They formed two locals, Local 142 of the International Brotherhood of Papermakers and Local 76 of the International Brotherhood of Pulp, Sulfite, and Paper Mill Workers. The Powell River Company and the unions came to an agreement almost immediately and created a minimum wage of 51 cents an hour, effective January 1st, 1938. This made Powell River the highest paid newsprint mill in Canada. Also in 1937, sawmill workers on Texada formed Local 2775 of the Sawmill Workers Union, and they received a pay raise. In the late 1930s, with higher salaries, locals were able to splurge a little and can afford to buy some expensive clothes and new appliances for their homes. The relief camp was shut down in 1936 and replaced by a forestry camp for single unemployed men at the same location. Then, in 1939, World War II broke out and changed everything. The dirty 30s were over. Government camps for unemployed men were shut down, and the Canadian government, which over the past decade had refused to run large deficits, changed course and began to go into debt with massive spending to finance its war effort. Interestingly, the deficits being run this year to face COVID-19 are the largest in Canadian history since World War II. Powell Riverites responded to the war and enlisted en masse into the Canadian Army. With their absence, the Powell River Company suddenly had a significant labor shortage, and in a big change began to employ women for the first time in its history. If you're interested in learning more about the history of the Great Depression in Powell River, there are several good local history books by local authors that are worth reading. Whoever Gives Us Bread by Lynn Bowen tells much of the story of Italian immigrants to British Columbia and includes lots of information about Powell River. Local author Barbara Lambert has written 2 good books, rich with memoirs on the subject: War Brides and Rosies and Rusty Nails and Ration Books. Prolific local historian Karen Southern wrote Pulp, Paper, and People for the 75th anniversary of Powell River. She also wrote The Nelson Island Story, a fascinating local history. Bill Thompson wrote a very detailed history of the mill, the Powell River Mill Story. And local historian Linda Wagner wrote Start Small, Big Dream, the history of the First Credit Union.